A single lantern, a body, and a town that swore it saw nothing. Welcome to Silent Casebook. I am your host, Sterling. Drop a comment. Where in the world are you tuning in from? I can't wait to read everyone. Let's dive in. The river carried a thin layer of mist that morning, rising from the dark water in slow curls. It clung to the stone bridge and drifted into the square where the shops were still shuttered. The Red Lantern Inn, its paint faded to a dull brown, was the only building showing signs of life. A single light burned in the upstairs window, as it always did, before the town stirred. Etienne Roux noticed it first. He was on his usual early walk, a habit formed in his years as a postman. Old habits never leave a man, even after retirement. He liked the quiet hour before anyone else came out, when the river smelled of wet earth and the world felt half asleep. Passing the inn, he frowned. The back door, the one Henri Delvaux used for deliveries, stood slightly ajar. It wasn't like Henri to forget a door. Etienne hesitated, glancing around the empty square, then knocked softly on the frame. No answer. The inn felt heavy with silence. He pushed the door wider, calling out a tentative, "Henri?" Inside, the smell hit him first. Stale beer, damp wood, and something faintly metallic. He stepped into the narrow hallway that led to the barroom. The red lantern was always dim, even by day, the windows smeared with river fog. A stool lay tipped on its side near the counter. Behind it, Henri Delvaux lay crumpled on the floor, one arm twisted beneath him. His eyes were open, glassy, and his cheek pressed against the worn wood boards as if he had been listening to them. Etienne didn't scream or run. He stood there a moment, hat in hand, his breath clouding in the cold air. Then he turned slowly and walked out, crossing the square to the café, where his wife, Madeleine, was already setting up for the morning. By the time the gendarmes arrived, word had spread through the small town like a damp fog of its own. Two fishermen lingered by the bridge, speaking in low voices. A woman carrying a loaf of bread stopped in the square and stayed, watching the inn's doorway as if expecting a play to begin. Life in a small town has a rhythm, and a death, even a quiet, lonely one, rings like a cracked bell. The local officer, Sergeant Lambert, was a broad man with a red face that seemed always on the verge of apology. He stepped inside first, his boots echoing in the stillness. Etienne followed, reluctant but curious, and Madeleine hovered at the threshold. Henri's body had not moved. Lambert crouched, checking for the pulse he knew wasn't there. "He's gone," he muttered, glancing back at Etienne as though for confirmation. "Fell," Etienne said quietly, though he hadn't seen a fall. It was the simplest thought, the one that would carry the least trouble. Lambert's eyes roamed the room, catching on the stool, the half-empty glass on the counter, the open back door. "Maybe," he said, though without conviction. He straightened and rubbed his jaw. "I should call the inspector in Saint-Pierre, just to be sure." The decision felt heavy in the room, as if summoning a stranger's eyes would make the death real in a different way. By mid-morning, a drizzle began, soft and persistent, soaking the square and turning the river mist into a grey curtain. Henri's body was carried out under a sheet and loaded onto a cart. The gendarmes spoke little, only to remind the onlookers to go home, though none of them did until the cart was gone. Across the street, Etienne and Madeleine sat in their café, staring out the window. The room smelled faintly of coffee and wet coats. Neither spoke at first. Finally, Madeleine said, "He looked angry. His face, I mean." Etienne shook his head. "Not angry. Surprised, maybe." They fell into silence again. Henri Delvaux had lived alone in that inn for 15 years since his mother died. He wasn't liked, but he wasn't hated either. He was a man people forgot until they needed him. A drink, late at night, a room for a travelling cousin. He didn't smile often, and when he did, it looked like a flinch. By noon, the news had reached the priest, Father Jules, who came walking slowly across the bridge with his black coat buttoned tight. He didn't ask questions. He only nodded to Etienne through the café window, as if the old postman were the official witness to all things in town. The drizzle turned to rain. The Red Lantern stood empty, its single upstairs light still burning. The square felt abandoned, though behind curtains people watched. At 3 in the afternoon, a car arrived from Saint-Pierre, its tires hissing on the wet stones. Out stepped a man in a grey coat and dark hat, his posture unhurried. He looked like someone who had learned long ago that people reveal themselves if you let silence do the work. Inspector Luc Morel had come only because protocol demanded it. A dead innkeeper in a small riverside town was rarely a matter of urgency. Lambert met him at the door and gave a short, awkward summary. Henri Delvaux, found this morning. Likely a fool. He lived alone. Morel removed his hat and glanced around the room. He didn't move toward the body's former place. He didn't need to. His eyes followed the lines of the floorboards, the scattered items on the counter, the way the back door opened onto the fog. "You've spoken to the neighbors?" he asked softly. "Only the Roux couple," Lambert said. "No one saw anything." Morel nodded and walked the room slowly, his hands in his coat pockets. He touched nothing. Outside, the rain tapped on the window pane. He noticed the overturned stool, the damp marks on the floor near the door, the faint smell of tobacco, despite Henri never having smoked. His gaze lingered on the shelf behind the bar. A row of glasses, one chipped, and an envelope tucked behind a bottle. He didn't reach for it, not yet. From the cafe, faces peered through the fogged glass, hoping for some sign of excitement. All they saw was a quiet man in a grey coat, standing still in the empty inn, as if listening for a voice that had already left the room. Evening settled early, and the town square glowed under the weak yellow of the street lamp. The Red Lantern sign creaked in the wind, its paint almost gone, the lantern symbol barely visible. Henri Delvaux was gone, and life in the town would continue. But under the ordinary rhythm, something had shifted. A small, cold gap where curiosity and unease would grow. Inspector Luc Morel stayed the night in the small guest room above the mayor's office. The mattress was lumpy, and the room smelled faintly of mildew and old paper. Through the single window he could see the square below, dim under the street lamp. The Red Lantern stood dark now, except for the one upstairs bulb that had burned all day. Someone should have switched it off, he thought. But perhaps leaving it on was the town's way of saying they were not yet ready to close the chapter. He had intended to leave in the morning. Cases like this, in his experience, ended with an unremarkable report. Accidental death, likely a fall, nothing further required. But lying in bed, listening to the faint sound of the rain against the glass, Morel thought about the inn's silence, the smell of tobacco, and the overturned stool. Small things, almost nothing, but they stayed with him. The next morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and shining under the pale light. He stepped out early before the town was fully awake and walked toward the river. The mist hung low over the water, curling around the stone bridge. It was a place that seemed made for secrets to linger, soft and persistent, like the smell of wet leaves. He paused by the inn. A notice had been pinned to the door, a clumsy piece of paper in Sergeant Lambert's handwriting. Closed until further notice. The square was quiet. A stray cat leapt from a barrel and vanished into the alley. Across the street, Etienne Roux was already at work in the café, wiping the same table twice as if time had slowed. Morel crossed over and stepped inside. The bell over the door gave a weak jingle. Etienne nodded politely, while his wife, Madeleine, glanced up from behind the counter with the sharp interest of someone who thrived on knowing what others didn't. "Coffee, Inspector?" Etienne asked, his voice low. "Please," Morel said, settling near the window. The café smelled of yesterday's bread and the faint tang of wood polish. It was a place where conversations were never hurried. Madeleine poured the coffee, her eyes never leaving him. "You'll be leaving today?" she asked. "Perhaps," Morel said. "I wanted to see the river first. Town's very quiet in the mornings." Madeleine sniffed. "Always quiet, too quiet if you ask me." She wiped her hands on her apron. "Henri's death. Well, it isn't right. Not that anyone will say it, but it isn't right." Her husband frowned. "Let the inspector drink his coffee, Madeleine." Morel said nothing. He preferred silence to direct questions. People filled silence with the things they truly wanted to say. "Sure enough," she continued. "I told him, didn't I? I told Henri many times. He should lock that door at night. Anyone could walk in. Not that anyone would. Still." She trailed off, studying the inspector's face for a reaction. Morel sipped his coffee slowly. It was strong and a little bitter. He watched the couple, noting the subtle tension in the way Etienne's hand tightened around his cloth, a quiet unease. In a town this small, a death rippled through everyone differently. It was less about fear than about the disturbance of routine, the reminder that the world could shift without warning. After breakfast, Morel walked the length of the riverbank. The houses leaned toward the water, their shutters flaking. He passed a fisherman mending a net, who looked up and nodded but said nothing. Further along, he saw Father Jules leaving the church, a black silhouette against the pale stone. "Good morning, Father," Morel said. The priest paused, adjusting his scarf. "Inspector, a sad business." "Yes," Morel agreed. "I wanted to ask, had you seen Henri recently?" Father Jules hesitated, the way people do when truth is simple, but something else lingers behind it. "I saw him at Mass last month. He rarely spoke. A man who carried his own weight, and perhaps more than his own." "A heavy man?" "Not in body," the priest said softly, looking toward the river. "He wore his loneliness like a coat. Some coats are hard to take off." Morel let the silence stretch. He could feel the priest shifting, as if words wanted to come but were pressed back. Eventually, Father Jules excused himself, murmuring about duties at the rectory. By late morning, Morel found himself back in the square. He stood in front of the inn, staring at the crooked sign with its faded lantern. He imagined Henri Delvaux moving through the quiet rooms at night, hearing the river outside, the clink of glasses, his own footsteps echoing against the wood. A man like that rarely died without leaving an echo behind. Sergeant Lambert appeared, puffing slightly from the climb up the street. "Inspector, thought I might find you here. The doctor signed the paper. Cause of death, fall, head injury, no signs of a struggle." "Hmm?" Morel said, his eyes still on the inn. "A fall, yes, likely at night. Probably, or early morning. These old floors are slippery." Lambert hesitated. "It will be easier for everyone if we call it an accident. You understand?" Morel nodded absently. Easier, yes, but easy things had a way of leaving questions behind. He had no desire to disrupt the town's fragile rhythm, yet something in him resisted turning away. He had built his career on waiting, on the quiet patience that let truth rise like river mist. he returned to the guest room in the afternoon and began writing his report. He described the scene plainly, listing observations without judgment. His pen paused when he came to the line, "cause of death." He left it blank for now. From the window, he saw Colette Delvaux arrive by the afternoon bus, a woman in her mid-30s with a dark coat and a hat pulled low. She carried a small suitcase and walked with the stiffness of someone returning to a place she had long avoided. People in the square noticed, but did not greet her. She went straight into the inn, unlocking the door with a key she produced from her pocket. Morel leaned back in his chair. He would stay one more night. Not because the case required it, but because the town itself seemed to be holding its breath. He wanted to see who would speak when the silence became too heavy to bear. Evening came slowly. From his window, Morel saw the square empty, the light fading into the same soft grey as the river. In the distance, a single dog barked, then stopped. He thought of Henri lying alone on the floor, and of the way the townspeople spoke of him, in half-sentences, in small shrugs. Death had not made him more beloved, only more present. When the last light faded, Morel reached for his coat and hat. He stepped into the night air, cool and damp, and walked the empty street. The inn's upstairs light was on again, casting a weak glow into the mist. Someone was moving inside, and the story, whatever it was, had only begun to surface. Colette Delvaux did not come out of the inn that first night. From the window of the guest room, Inspector Luc Morel saw the faint blur of light through the curtains upstairs, sometimes moving as a shadow crossed in front of it, sometimes still for long stretches. He imagined her sitting on the edge of a bed she had not slept in for years, hands clasped tightly, the silence of the house pressing against her. By morning, the square was alive in its own subdued way. Fishermen crossed the bridge with their nets, the baker opened his shutters, and Etienne Roux swept the stones in front of the café. People glanced toward the Red Lantern but did not linger. They were careful to keep the rhythm of life moving, as if pretending nothing unusual had happened would make it so. Morel stepped into the square just as Colette emerged from the inn. Her black coat was buttoned to the collar, her hat shading her eyes. She locked the door behind her and paused, taking a slow breath before crossing toward the café. Morel met her halfway. "Madame Delvaux," he said gently. She hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Inspector." Her voice was quiet, almost flat. "I'm sorry for your loss." She stared past him toward the river, her lips pressing together before she spoke. Again. "Thank you, I wasn't here." "I understand." Morel kept his tone calm, giving her space. "You've come to settle things?" "Yes. I suppose someone has to. The house, the inn. Everything is mine now. It feels strange to even say that." Her voice trembled slightly on the last word. He did not ask her the questions that crowded his mind, about the last time she had spoken to her father, about whether she had expected this call. Instead, he fell into step beside her as she walked toward the café. Inside, Etienne and Madeleine greeted her with polite reserve, voices soft as if any loudness might shatter the air. Over coffee, Colette's eyes stayed on the window. "I left this town 10 years ago," she said suddenly, not looking at Morel. "I didn't think I'd ever come back. My father and we didn't speak much. He was not a cruel man, but he had a way of making everything feel heavy." Madeleine set a plate of bread between them and crossed her arms. "He was a lonely man," she said, with the unvarnished bluntness that came from living in the same place all her life. Colette flinched, just slightly. "Ah, yes." "Lonely." Morel sipped his coffee, letting the words settle. People rarely confessed the truth directly. It came in fragments, in the spaces between sentences. He watched the way Colette's fingers tapped the side of the cup, an unconscious rhythm of nerves. When she finally met his gaze, there was a flicker of guilt there. Not the guilt of crime, but of absence. "I hadn't seen him since Mother's funeral," she said. "He wrote me once, about 3 years ago, a short letter. He asked if I was happy in Lyon. I didn't reply." Morel inclined his head slightly. "It can be difficult to answer a letter like that." She exhaled, almost a laugh, but without warmth. "Yes, it's easier not to answer at all." Silence followed. Outside, the square was filling with ordinary sounds. A cart rolling over cobblestones, a dog barking at a fisherman, the river sliding beneath the bridge, yet inside, the air felt still, as if a part of the inn's quiet had followed Colette here. Morel knew better than to push. He let the conversation fade and left her in the café, moving on to walk the riverbank again. That afternoon he returned to the inn with Sergeant Lambert. Colette had unlocked the door and was moving through the downstairs rooms, her footsteps cautious on the uneven floors. Dust had already begun to settle in the corners, as if the house had been holding its breath for years and only now exhaled. "This place feels—" she began but didn't finish the sentence. "Empty?" Morel suggested. "Empty, yes, but also as if it remembers things I've forgotten." In the kitchen, a single plate still sat in the drying rack, and a knife with a worn wooden handle lay on the counter. Upstairs, the hallway smelled faintly of old linens and tobacco. Colette paused at the doorway to her childhood bedroom, the bed neatly made, the curtains half closed. Morel noticed her glance at the wardrobe, and then away quickly. Shadows stretched in the corners of the room, and he sensed memories she did not want to touch. "Madame Delvaux," he said softly, "if you recall anything unusual, no matter how small, please tell me. Even a feeling." She hesitated, hand on the doorframe. "I had a dream last night. I was standing in the bar downstairs, and he was sitting at the counter, as he used to, staring at me without speaking. Then I woke up. That's all." Morel nodded. Dreams were often more honest than words. Later that day, he found Etienne Roux outside, smoking his single afternoon cigarette by the river. The old postman nodded as Morel approached. "She came back then?" Etienne said, watching the current. "Yes." "She won't stay, people like that. They leave, and the place doesn't forgive them. But they don't forgive it either." Morel studied the man's profile. "Did Henri ever speak about her?" "Not much. He wasn't one to speak about anything." Etienne flicked ash into the water. "I saw him once standing by the bridge, just staring at the river for a long time. That was the year she left. He never looked the same after." "Lonely," Morel said, echoing Madeleine's word. Etienne shook his head. "Lonely, yes. But there was something else, like a man waiting for something that would never come." The words lingered as Morel walked back through the square. He could feel the private shadows of the Delvaux family pressing against the town. Old silences, quiet regrets, and the heaviness of years lived apart under the same roof. Henri's death had not only left a gap, it had opened a door to all the things no one had ever said aloud. That night, as darkness fell and the mist returned to the river, Morel sat at his small desk and wrote in his notebook, "The inn is silent, but the daughter carries its echoes. Her guilt is quiet but heavy. There is more here than a fall. A life like Henri Delvaux's doesn't end by accident alone." He set down his pen and listened to the soft creak of the building settling, the whisper of the river outside. In the stillness, The town felt like it was holding back a truth it did not yet have the courage to speak. The following morning, the square carried a faint smell of river mud and bread baking. It was a smell that belonged to small towns where life moved without hurry and nothing truly left. Inspector Luc Morel walked slowly across the cobblestones, hat low against the damp wind. He had slept lightly, his thoughts restless with the weight of things unsaid. Through the window of Etienne Roux's café, he saw Colette Delvaux sitting at a corner table, untouched coffee cooling in front of her. She was staring at the square, the red lantern's darkened windows reflecting in her eyes. Her shoulders were hunched, her hands clasped on the table. When he entered, the little bell gave its usual weak jingle. The warmth inside felt heavy with the smell of butter and black coffee. Madeleine Roux glanced at him but said nothing. She had already learned that the inspector preferred silence first, words second. "Morning," Etienne murmured, wiping a counter that was already clean. Morel removed his hat and nodded to Colette. "May I join you?" She hesitated, then gestured to the empty chair. They sat quietly for a moment, watching the square as a cart rolled past, the old horse's hooves clopping on the stones. "Do they all look at me like that?" she asked suddenly, her voice low. "Like what?" "Like I came back to bring the rain." Her fingers tightened around the coffee cup. "I can feel it in their eyes. They know I left, they know I stayed gone. And now he's dead and I'm here and it's too late for anything." Morel studied her profile. People in towns like this, they don't forget departures, but they don't remember reasons either, only the leaving. She gave a soft, bitter laugh. Yes, they forget everything but the wound. Across the café, Madeleine banged a drawer shut a little harder than necessary. Etienne murmured something to her, and she went into the back room. The café was never truly private, but the air carried the sense of whispered things. "Did your father have any visitors recently?" Morel asked, keeping his tone mild. "I wouldn't know." She shook her head. "We spoke only twice in 10 years. A postcard, once, then a letter, when he sold the upstairs rooms. He said the inn wasn't what it used to be." "Did he sound troubled?" "He always sounded the same," she said after a pause. "Like someone halfway between waiting and giving up." Morel let the words rest between them. He had learned that in grief people rarely spoke in facts. They spoke in images, in memories, weighted with emotion. That afternoon, he visited the post office, a cramped room with yellowing walls and the faint smell of glue. Old letters lined the shelves and a dusty clock ticked over the counter. Madame Fournier, the postmistress, greeted him with a careful smile. "You're asking about Henri?" she said, before he even asked. "Yes." "I wondered if he received much mail." "Hardly any. An electric bill, a bank notice, nothing else in months. The last personal letter I saw was, maybe a year ago, a handwriting I didn't recognize, slim envelope." He stared at it for a long time before leaving. "Do you recall if he replied?" She shook her head. "Not that I saw. He wasn't the writing sort." "Do you know who sent it?" "Local stamp," she said after thinking. "But people send letters from nearby towns too. Could be anyone." Morel thanked her and stepped outside. The sky was turning the color of tarnished silver, and a cold breeze carried the smell of wet leaves. A single bell from the church tower marked the hour, echoing through the streets like a reminder that time was still moving, even if the town felt suspended. That evening, he found himself back in the café. A few locals sat by the window playing cards without much talk. The murmur of conversation dipped and rose like the river itself. Morel chose a table near the door. After a while, Etienne approached and set down a glass of wine without being asked. "On the house, Inspector. For the weather, thank you." Etienne lingered, cloth in hand. He glanced toward the card players, then back at Morel. "You're staying longer than I thought." "Just observing," Morel said. Etienne hesitated, his voice lowering. "People have started talking. You know how it is. Henri's death. People wonder if maybe he didn't fall." "Because?" The innkeeper leaned on the counter, his eyes fixed on the wet stones outside. "Because Henri wasn't the kind of man to just fall. He drank, yes, but he didn't stumble. He was careful, set in his ways. And—" He stopped. "And—" Etienne's jaw tightened. "And there was talk last winter. Someone saw a stranger leaving the inn late one night. Henri said it was a traveller who got lost, but there was no car, no luggage, just a man in a long coat walking out into the dark. That's all." "Did anyone else see him?" "Madeleine," she said the same. "But we didn't think much of it. In a place like this, sometimes you see what you want to see." Morel nodded slowly. "And what do you think you saw?" Etienne's fingers twitched on the cloth. "A shadow that didn't belong here." When Morel stepped outside into the evening, the air had cooled sharply. The lanterns glowed weakly through the mist, and the Red Lantern Inn loomed across the square, its windows blank. He watched the upstairs light flicker as Colette moved through the rooms. Somewhere behind those walls lay the weight of years. Letters not answered, words not spoken, shadows that lingered after the man himself had gone. He returned to his guest room and wrote a single note in his journal before blowing out the lamp. The town knows more than it says, and some shadows walk away, but not far. The days after Henri Delvau's death settled over the town like a fog that would not lift. Life continued. Bread was baked, nets were cast, letters were delivered, but beneath the surface, the weight of the innkeeper's absence pressed against everyone who had known him, and even those who hadn't. It was not grief in the usual sense. Henri had not been beloved. He had been a fixed point, a silent presence that asked for nothing but watched everything. His death left a strange kind of echo, and in that echo people began to remember things they had ignored. Inspector Luc Morel woke early each morning to the distant murmur of the river and the hollow quiet of his guest room. He had spent his career in towns like this, places where tragedy did not roar but seeped in quietly, filling the corners of ordinary life. He knew to look not for sudden revelations, but for the subtle cracks that opened in people when a long-standing weight was removed. On the fifth morning, he walked toward the Red Lantern. Mist clung to the cobblestones, and the inn looked abandoned despite Colette's presence inside. He knocked gently on the door, and after a pause, she opened it. She wore the same black coat, hair unbrushed, and her eyes carried the dull shine of someone who had slept little. "You're early," she said, voice rough. "I wanted to see how you were managing." "I'm managing." She stepped aside to let him in. The air in the inn was cool and stale. The wooden beams creaked with each step. On the bar counter sat a single glass, half filled with water, and a plate with crumbs, as if someone had eaten, standing up and left the meal unfinished. "Did you sleep?" he asked. "Some." She hesitated, then looked toward the staircase. "I keep hearing him, not footsteps. More like him breathing. You know how a house remembers its owner? Every sound, every pause?" Morel nodded. "Old houses hold on to things." She gave a small, uneven laugh. "Or maybe it's me." Maybe I'm trying to find him in the walls because I didn't look for him when he was alive." He didn't answer. Guilt was a kind of ghost in itself, and he had seen it haunt more people than any crime ever had. Later that day, Morel went to the riverbank, where two fishermen were mending their nets. One of them, Pierre Levine, was a thick-shouldered man with a face weathered like old driftwood. He glanced up as Morel approached. "You're still poking around," Pierre said. "Not unfriendly, just stating a fact." "Routine," Morel replied. "Sometimes people remember things later, small things." Pierre tied a knot in the net, then paused. "I remember something, maybe nothing. I'll take maybe nothing." Pierre squinted toward the inn, its red shutters dark against the pale sky. "2 nights before he died, I was walking back from the river late. I saw light in his upstairs window, which wasn't unusual, but then I heard a voice. Not his, a man's voice, low, like they were arguing quietly. Could you make out words? Number. But it wasn't friendly. Then it stopped, and the light went out not long after. I thought maybe I imagined it. Henri didn't get many visitors." "Did you see anyone leave?" "Number. But there are a dozen ways out of that inn if you know it well. And Henri didn't like locks. He said locks made a place feel like a prison." Morel nodded. He thanked Pierre and continued along the river, letting the information settle. A quiet argument, a light gone out. It was the sort of detail that lived in the space between certainty and suspicion. In the afternoon, he returned to the café. A drizzle had begun, and the glass door squeaked when he pushed it open. Inside, Etienne and Madeleine moved with the slow rhythm of people who had already done the same things 1,000 times. A kettle whistled softly. "Any news?" Etienne asked, pouring coffee before Morel could even request it. "Not news," the inspector said. "Memories." Madeleine wiped her hands on her apron and leaned on the counter. "That's all we have in a place like this. Memories and silence." "Did either of you ever see someone visit Henri late at night?" Madeleine glanced at her husband. A flicker passed between them. A shared thought they had not planned to speak aloud. "I saw someone once," she said finally. "Months ago. A man in a grey coat standing under the street lamp by the inn. He didn't knock, just waited. Then he went in after a while. Henri never mentioned it. Would you recognize him? Number 8 was dark and I didn't look long, but I remember thinking he didn't walk like someone from here. Too careful, like he didn't want to be seen." Morel stirred his coffee slowly. "And you didn't tell anyone?" Madeleine shrugged. "People come and go, and Henri, he kept his own shadows." The inspector finished his drink in silence, letting the sounds of the café, the clink of cups, the scrape of chairs, fill the space between questions. He knew enough now to feel the presence of the emotional ghosts that lingered over the town. Henri's death had pulled something loose, and the whispers of guilt, regret, and quiet suspicion were starting to drift through the streets. On that evening, Morel walked past the inn again. The square was nearly empty, a wet gleam on the stones from the drizzle. Through the upstairs window, he saw Colette sitting in a chair, not moving, staring at nothing. He paused at the bridge, the river sliding beneath him with its patient, eternal sound. The air smelled of wet leaves and old wood. He thought of Henri standing here alone, as people had described, and wondered what thoughts had filled that silence. Back in his guest room, he opened his notebook and wrote, "The house is full of echoes. Not of footsteps, but of things never said. The living carry the dead in pieces of guilt. Henri's death stirs not fear of crime, but fear of memory. He closed the notebook and let the night settle in, carrying with it the weight of the unspoken. The next morning arrived grey and brittle. The kind of morning when the light itself seemed hesitant to touch the streets, as if the town were a place better left in shadow. Inspector Luc Morel woke to the sound of a distant bell and the faint scent of wet stone. He had learned long ago that investigations in towns like this were not solved by evidence or swift confessions, but by the slow erosion of silence. People talked, eventually, even if only with their eyes. He left his guest room and crossed the square toward the Red Lantern Inn. The shutters were closed, though it was late enough that most homes were awake. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the chimney, but the door remained firmly shut. He knocked softly, then a second time. Colette opened the door an inch, her face pale in the cold light. "Inspector, may I come in?" A pause. Her eyes flicked to the staircase behind her. "Now's not a good time." "It will only take a moment." She hesitated, then opened the door wide enough for him to step inside. The air in the inn felt stale, like a house that had been left unoccupied too long. He noticed the curtains had been drawn tight, shutting out what little light there was. "I didn't sleep much," she said, moving toward the counter. "I keep thinking someone's here, or maybe I want him to be here, which is worse." Morel didn't answer. He was looking toward the door at the end of the hall. It was closed. "That leads to the storage rooms?" he asked. She stiffened. "Yes, I haven't gone in there yet." "Why not?" Her eyes wavered for a moment. "Because it smells like him. His coat, his tobacco. I can't—" Her voice trailed off, and she gripped the edge of the counter as if steadying herself. And that afternoon, Morel walked the length of the riverbank again, letting the town reveal its moods in small fragments. He passed the baker, who gave him a curt nod, and the postmistress, who pretended not to watch him from behind the window. People had begun to avoid conversation, a sure sign that gossip had turned into something heavier. Quiet suspicion. He turned down a narrow alley and came to the back of the inn. A wooden shed leaned against the wall, its roof sagging under the weight of years. A single padlock secured the shed door, but he could see through the gaps in the wood. Barrels, a ladder, a coil of rope, and dust. It didn't look as though anyone had been in there for weeks. He tried the back door of the inn, found it locked, and noted a fresh scuff mark on the stone step, as though someone had dragged something heavy across it recently. By evening, he returned to the café. Etienne Roux poured him a glass of red wine without a word. A single kerosene lamp flickered in the corner, casting long shadows along the walls. The card players were absent tonight. The room felt emptier than usual. "Colette keeping to herself?" Etienne asked quietly. "Yes." Madeleine, drying a cup, glanced toward the window where the inn's shutters were still closed. "It isn't right, a house like that shut up so tight. Henri always left a lamp in the window. Said he liked knowing people could see the Red Lantern even from the river." "Do you think she's hiding something?" Morel asked. Madeleine hesitated, then shrugged. "Everyone's hiding something. That's what keeps a small town quiet. But I'll tell you one thing. She hasn't gone to the attic. I know because I saw the shutters. Henri kept that window cracked for air, always. Now it's shut tight. Either she hasn't been up there, or she doesn't want anyone else to go." Later that night, the inspector crossed the square again. Mist rose from the river, and the inn loomed dark except for a faint light in the upstairs window. He hesitated at the door, listening. The building gave a soft creak, the sound of wood settling in the cold. He knocked gently. Colette opened the door only a fraction. "It's late," she said. "I won't stay," Morel replied, his voice calm. "I just wanted to check on you." Her eyes flickered toward the staircase. Behind her, the hall seemed darker than it should. "I'm fine," she said quickly. I don't think I can talk any more tonight." "I understand." He tipped his hat and turned back toward the square. As he walked away, he felt the weight of the inn at his back, the way a silent witness presses against a man's thoughts. A house with its doors shut was like a heart holding its breath. He had learned long ago that secrets did not always hide in darkness, they hid in stillness. In his notebook that night, Morel wrote, "Someone has closed a door, and they are waiting for it to stay closed. Guilt is patient, but houses remember." He set down his pen and listened to the faint drip of rain outside. Somewhere across the square, Colette Delvaux was alone in her father's house, surrounded by the ghosts of his presence and whatever memory lay behind that locked door. The town itself seemed to pause, as if holding a secret between its teeth. By the seventh day, the rhythm of the town had changed. People went about their business, but the conversations were shorter, the greetings more restrained. The absence of Henri Delvaux had created a space that seemed to demand an explanation, and when explanations were scarce, suspicion began to take root in the cracks left by silence. Inspector Luc Morel felt it in the air, in the way shutters closed a little faster as he passed, and in the way the townspeople now spoke in pairs or trios, their voices lowered, their words clipped when they saw him approach. He knew this stage well. A death in a small town was like a stone dropped into a still pond. The first ripples were grief and shock, but sooner or later the ripples of blame reached the edges. He decided to begin his day at the market square. A few stalls were open despite the grey sky, offering the usual collection of bread, root vegetables, and salted fish. As he strolled through, he noticed people watching him from the corners of their eyes. He stopped at Pierre Lavigne's stall, where the fishermen sold small river trout from a shallow wooden box filled with melting ice. Pierre's hands were red and raw from the cold. "You've been making your rounds," Pierre said. His tone was careful. "It's my work," Morel replied. "It's people remember things over time." Pierre glanced around as if to check who might be listening, then leaned closer. "They're saying he had enemies." "Henri? A man like that. He made people uneasy. Quiet men with sharp eyes always do. They're saying maybe he finally pushed someone too far." Morel didn't respond immediately. "And who do they think that someone is?" Pierre hesitated. "Your guess is as good as mine. Some say it's that drifter who was around last month. Some say it's someone closer." "Closer?" Pierre's gaze flicked toward the riverbank, where the inn stood, its shutters still half closed. "Family brings out the worst in people. You know that, Inspector." As that afternoon, Morel found himself back at the café. The air inside was warm, carrying the scent of bread and wood smoke. Etienne and Madeleine were behind the counter, whispering until they saw him enter. "I'll have coffee," he said. Madeleine brought it over, glancing at the single other patron. An old man who sat in the corner with a newspaper he wasn't really reading. "People are starting to talk," she said softly, sliding the cup toward him. "What are they saying?" "That Colette knows more than she's saying, that she argued with her father, that she wanted to sell the inn, and he refused." Madeleine hesitated, then lowered her voice further. "And that she's been seen near the river at night." "Have you seen her there?" "No," she admitted. "But someone said they did. That's enough for a story to grow legs in this town." Morel sipped his coffee, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. He did not like the way suspicion moved, like smoke curling under doors and through keyholes, finding the smallest spaces to settle. It never stayed clean. It clung to whoever it touched. "Do you believe it?" he asked. Madeleine looked at him for a long moment. "I believe she's alone now, and that loneliness makes people cruel." Later that day, he visited the small post office. The postmistress, Madame Villon, was sorting envelopes with a precision that suggested she valued order as much as breadth. "Any letters for the Delvaux family lately?" he asked. She glanced up, her expression unreadable. "One last week. A thin one, foreign stamp. I delivered it myself." "To Henri?" "Yes. I didn't look at the sender. I'm not in the business of curiosity." But the flicker in her eyes said otherwise. "Did he say anything about it?" But I saw him stand outside with it in his hand for a long time before going in. I thought he looked disappointed. A foreign letter, a closed door, and now a daughter people were beginning to whisper about. In small towns, truth and rumour wove themselves together until even the innocent felt guilty. That evening, Morel walked through the misty square toward the inn. He paused beneath the lantern at the corner, where the light fell in a soft circle. The shutters were still drawn, but he could see a faint glow upstairs. He had not seen Colette in 2 days. He knocked once, twice. No answer. He waited. Finally he heard footsteps, then the soft scrape of the lock. Colette appeared in the doorway, her face pale and her hair loose around her shoulders. "You shouldn't come here at night," she said. "I was concerned." "I'm fine." Her voice was flat, almost mechanical. "People are beginning to talk," he said gently. "You know how it goes. Silence makes them invent their own truths." Her eyes flickered with a flash of something. Anger or fear, he couldn't tell. "Let 'em talk. They talked when he was alive. They talked when I was a child. It's all they know how to do." "Still," Morel said softly, "a little light helps." Shutters open, doors not so closed. She hesitated, then shook her head. Not yet. And before he could speak again, she closed the door. Morel walked back through the square, feeling the eyes of the town on him, even if no one was there. A suspect had emerged, but not because of evidence, because the town needed someone to carry the weight of its unease. Colette Delvaux had become that someone, whether she was guilty or not. In his notebook that night he wrote, "Guilt travels like water. It finds the lowest place to settle. The town has chosen its vessel." And outside, the river flowed on quiet and dark, carrying secrets it would never give back. Inspector Luc Morel had learned that in small towns truth rarely revealed itself to those who chased it too hard. The louder the questions, the tighter the doors closed. Observation, patience, and silence were his tools. He rose early that morning, before the mist had fully lifted from the river, and walked the square slowly, as if he had nowhere particular to be. From the bench beneath the old plane tree, he could see the Red Lantern Inn in profile. Its shutters were closed except for a narrow sliver on the top floor, where a thin line of light had escaped the night before. He watched the chimney. No smoke this morning. The house looked like it was holding its breath. He took out his small notebook, the one with the dark leather cover that he had been carrying for 20 years. His notes for this case were sparse. He never wrote down gossip, only gestures and facts. He sketched the inn's silhouette and wrote a single line beneath it. "The house waits longer than people do." He spent the rest of the morning walking the town in deliberate circles. He stopped by the baker's for a loaf he didn't need, and by the shoemaker's for a conversation that barely lasted 2 sentences. People were polite, but their eyes slid away. He recognized the shift. Suspicion had matured into quiet accusation. When he reached the riverbank, he paused. Across the water, he could see the path that wound up the low hill toward the abandoned mill. A solitary figure moved there, Colette. She was carrying a small bundle and walking with her head bent. He did not follow, not yet. Instead, he leaned against the railing of the old bridge and let the river's slow current pull his thoughts along. It wasn't evidence he was after, it was understanding, and understanding required giving people space to reveal themselves when they believed no one was looking. That afternoon, he walked to the inn again. He did not knock this time, but circled around to the back, where the old shed leaned against the wall. He crouched near the step where he had seen the scuff marks days before. Kneeling, he noticed a faint trail in the dust of the back path. Not footprints exactly, but the drag of something soft, perhaps a piece of fabric or a blanket. It led toward the shed but stopped just short of the door. He tried the handle gently. Still locked. Standing, he let his gaze rise to the second floor. One window shutter was slightly ajar, and for the briefest moment, he thought he saw movement. A curtain lifting, then falling back. He stayed for a minute longer, then left without announcing himself. He wanted Colette to believe he hadn't been there at all. The day bled into a pale, early evening. He chose the corner table at Etienne's cafe, the one that gave him the widest view of the square. He ordered nothing but black coffee and sat, listening to the quiet murmur of the room. Madeleine came over once. "You're watching again," she said softly. "It's the only way to see anything," Morel replied. "People think you're protecting her," she whispered. "I'm not protecting anyone. I'm watching." She hesitated, then nodded and returned to the counter. Through the window he saw the baker cross the square and glance at the inn before vanishing into the side street. Then old Madame Roussel shuffled by, leaning on her cane, pausing just long enough to stare at the inn with a mixture of pity and unease. Every gesture was a confession in its own way. A town bleeding its discomfort through glances and detours. After nightfall, he left the cafe and walked the streets once more. He knew which windows to look at and which shadows to trust. The town was nearly silent, save for the occasional bark of a dog or the distant rush of the river. He passed the post office and noticed a small detail. The latch on the rear window was open. He paused, considered it, then moved on. It wasn't his business. Not yet. When he reached the inn, he saw a faint glow from the attic window. Slowly he crossed the square and leaned against the wall of the church, where the angle let him see without being seen. Inside that window, Colette moved like a ghost. She was kneeling near a trunk, her hair catching the lamplight. He could see her lift an object, something dark, maybe a coat, and press it to her face. Her shoulders shook as if she were crying, though the glass and distance swallowed the sound. After a few minutes, she rose, snuffed the lamp, and disappeared into the darkness of the house. Morel waited until the window was completely dark before leaving his place of observation. He did not knock or try to speak to her. Words were not ready to cross that distance yet. Instead, he walked down to the riverbank and listened to the water. The night was cold and carried a hint of smoke from some distant chimney. He thought about what he had seen. A young woman holding on to the last traces of someone who might never return, or perhaps someone she had reason to mourn in secret. He had seen it before. Grief and guilt looked almost identical from the outside. In his notebook that night he wrote, "She hides in the house, but the house cannot hide her heart. Every movement, every silence is a word she does not speak." But the next morning he rose with the sun and returned to the same bench under the plane tree. A slow drizzle began to fall, making the cobblestones shine. The square was empty except for a single cart rattling past. He watched the inn again. This time the shutters opened just slightly on the lower floor. A fragile gesture, but it told him everything he needed to know. Colette was reaching the edge of her endurance. People only began to open windows when the weight of their own silence became heavier than the judgment of the town. For Morel, the observation was enough. Truth was coming, and it would come quietly, the way rain seeped into stone. The drizzle had turned to steady rain by the following morning, leaving the square glistening and empty. Inspector Luc Morel stood under the eave of the church, watching droplets run down the stone steps. The town seemed even smaller when wet. Its corners tightened and the air pressed close. He had learned that secrets rarely lived alone. One confession led to another, even if the second had nothing to do with the first. Small towns carried histories like sediment at the bottom of a river, invisible until the current shifted. Henri Delvau's death had stirred the current, and now Morel was waiting to see what would rise to the surface. He decided to start with the post office. Madame Villon was at her desk, sorting envelopes with her usual precision, but she looked up when he entered and gave the smallest nod of acknowledgement. "You walk early?" she said. "And you work earlier," he replied, stepping closer. He glanced toward the pigeonholes behind her. "Any letters for the Delvaux house?" Her hands paused. "One. Came this morning." "May I?" "I can't open it for you, Inspector." "I don't ask you to, just to tell me what you see." She hesitated, then turned to examine the envelope. Foreign again. Same handwriting as last week. Belgian, I think. Heavy paper. Morel thanked her and left, his mind turning the small fact over and over. A second letter meant that Henri had been in contact with someone far from the town. A friend, an enemy, a creditor? Letters carried more weight in small lives than in grand ones. They rarely arrived without a shadow attached. On his way to the inn, he took the long route by the river. The water was high from the rain, a slow-moving grey mirror. He stopped at the bend where the bank sloped down to a cluster of reeds. Something dark clung there, a scrap of cloth caught on a branch. He knelt and pulled it free. It was a man's scarf, heavy wool, soaked and muddy. He turned it in his hands and noticed faint initials stitched at the corner, H.D. Henri Delvaux. Morel stood with the scarf dripping between his fingers, the water running cold down his wrist. He didn't feel the thrill of discovery, only the quiet weight of it. The river had been holding this piece of the story in its mouth, and now it had let it go. When he reached the inn, he knocked. After a long pause, Colette opened the door. Her eyes were ringed with sleeplessness, and her hands were pale against the wood. "You're early," she said. "I walk in the rain," Morel replied. He held up the scarf. "Does this belong here?" She stared at it for a long time, her lips parting, but no words coming out. Finally, she nodded. "It's my father's. Do you know how it ended up in the river?" Her eyes flicked past him toward the water beyond the square. "No." He waited, letting the silence stretch. Small silences, he knew, could do the work of long questions. "He wore it the night he disappeared," she said at last. Her voice cracked. "I thought maybe he took it with him." "Disappeared?" Morel repeated softly. "You never say died?" Her hand gripped the doorframe. "I don't know what to say. He's gone. Isn't that enough?" "Sometimes," Morel said. "Gone is the heaviest word." He left her at the door and walked slowly to Etienne's café. He needed warmth, and he needed to listen. Inside, the smell of coffee and damp coats filled the air. A few men sat along the wall, speaking in low voices that fell silent when Morel entered. Etienne poured a cup without being asked. "Bad weather for thinking," he said. "Good weather for listening," Morel replied. The men in the corner returned to their murmurs, but now Morel caught fragments. The scarf. River. Girl doesn't leave the house. Gossip had grown sharper teeth overnight. Madeleine appeared with a towel to wipe the counter, though it was already dry. "Someone saw her on the hill again," she whispered. "Last night, before the rain, said she was carrying something." "Who saw her?" "Old Rousseau. He was walking back from the mill, but you know him. He drinks, he guesses." Morel nodded, but he knew that rumours didn't need to be true to carry weight. A second secret was forming in the air, as palpable as the smell of wet earth. By afternoon, the rain had softened to mist. Morel took the path up the hill toward the abandoned mill, following the direction the old man had mentioned. The ground was soft, and his boots left prints that would not last an hour. The mill stood grey and hollow against the sky. Its door sagged open, and a bird startled from the rafters as he stepped inside. The smell of damp wood and old grain filled the space. He scanned the floor and noticed something strange in the corner. A small pile of burnt paper, blackened edges curling like petals. He knelt to sift through the ashes. The rain had dampened some fragments but not destroyed them all. On one piece, faint ink had survived, the curve of a letter, the bottom of a foreign stamp. Letters. Henri's letters, burned here in secret. That night, Morel sat in his room at the boarding house and opened his notebook. He wrote in careful lines. A second secret has surfaced. The girl walks to the mill at night, letters burned, father's scarf in the river. Guilt is heavier than grief. He closed the book and listened to the rain ticking against the glass. Somewhere across the square, in the house with its cautious shutters, Colette Delvaux was carrying a burden that would soon become too heavy to bear. And beyond that, another shadow waited. The sender of the letters, the story that the river and the ashes had only begun to whisper. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the air heavy and still, as if the town was holding its breath. Inspector Luc Morel woke to the sound of a distant church bell and the faint scrape of a broom in the square below his window. He dressed without hurry, his movements precise, his mind already turning over the fragments he carried. A wet scarf, the burned letters, and the way Colette Delvaux had pressed her lips together when she said her father had disappeared. The town was changing around him, and he felt it in the air. Not in any official way, but in the faces that shifted when he passed, the words that stopped in the middle of a sentence. There was a weight here now, a moral heaviness that pressed not on the guilty alone, but on everyone who lived near the Red Lantern Inn. He began the day at the bakery. Monsieur Perrin, broad-shouldered and dusted with flour, gave him a nod as he entered. "You walk early," the baker said, repeating a line Morel had heard in every shop by now. "It's a good habit," Morel replied. He waited, letting the silence invite more. The baker hesitated before speaking again. "She looks worse each day." "Who?" "You know who, the girl. She came by before dawn, didn't even buy bread, just stood outside like she was deciding whether to knock, then walked away again." "She say anything?" "Nothing. But she looked frightened, like someone carrying a shadow on her back." Leaving the bakery, Morel wandered toward the river. He always found clarity in the slow-moving water. The scarf, now dried and folded, was in his pocket. He took it out and ran a finger along the stitched initials. He imagined Henri Delvaux standing on this bank, the scarf around his neck, a man with a secret life that had begun to surface only in fragments. The scarf in the river. The letters burned in the mill, the daughter awake at night, moving like a ghost. The pieces did not yet make a confession, but they painted the outline of a heart under siege. That afternoon, he went to the inn again. This time, he did not knock. He opened the gate and walked to the back garden. The weeds were high, the ground damp. Colette was there, kneeling in the soil, her hands caked in mud. She started when she saw him, but didn't rise. "You walk everywhere?" she said, her voice flat. "It helps me see," he said. He crouched a few steps away, his tone gentle. "The town talks. It says you walk to the mill at night." Her shoulders stiffened. "I walk to forget." "To forget what?" She didn't answer. Her fingers pressed harder into the mud, leaving deep crescents. He could feel the moral pressure around her, the silent weight that was breaking her piece by piece. "Colette," he said softly, "grief can live quietly. Guilt cannot. It shows in the way we look at the ground when people speak to us, in the way our hands shake even when we try to hide them." Her breath hitched. "You don't know anything." "I know enough to see that someone has left you alone with too much." She rose abruptly, her skirt damp with soil, and retreated toward the door without another word. She didn't slam it. The soft click of the latch was somehow heavier than a shout. Evening settled slowly, wrapping the town in a kind of grey resignation. Morel returned to Etienne's café and took his usual corner seat. People came and went, speaking in low voices. He could feel the weight of their avoidance, the way their eyes slid toward him and then away. Madeleine approached with his coffee. She lingered a moment, her hands tight around the tray. "She'll break soon," she said quietly. "Who?" Morel asked, though he knew. "The girl. You can see it in her face. It's not the kind of sadness that lasts. It's the kind that spills over. She'll either confess or vanish." "People don't always vanish because of guilt," Morel said. "No," Madeleine admitted. "But they vanish because they can't carry what's inside them anymore." He nodded. The café door opened, letting in a gust of night air and the sound of distant water. Old Madame Roussel hobbled in, leaning on her cane. She paused by his table, her eyes sharp despite her age. "You're waiting for a confession," she said. "I'm waiting for the truth," he replied. "Truth is nothing without shame," she muttered, "and this town is drowning in both." But that night he could not sleep. He sat by his window, the square empty below, and watched the inn. The shutters on the lower floor were closed, but a thin light glowed behind them. He imagined Colette moving through the rooms, touching objects that still smelled of her father, trying to decide which memory would break her first. Around midnight, he left the boarding house and walked silently through the square. He did not approach the inn, but circled toward the river instead. He stood on the bridge, looking down at the black water. It moved slowly, as if burdened by its own secrets. Behind him, a faint sound, the creak of a door. He turned his head slightly. Across the square, the inn's side door opened, and Colette stepped out, wrapped in a shawl. She hesitated at the threshold, then began to walk toward the river, her head bowed. Morel didn't move. He let her reach the bank, let her stand at the water's edge for a long time, motionless except for the tremor in her shoulders. Finally, she knelt, as if speaking to the water, her face hidden from him. When she rose and walked back to the inn, her steps were unsteady. The door closed behind her with the same soft click as before. Back in his room, Morel opened his notebook. He wrote carefully, the words more observation than conclusion. She walks to the river to speak with someone who cannot answer. Shame grows heavier than grief. It will break her soon. He paused and added one more line. The town does not need a confession to condemn her, but she will give one, to the river, to me, or to herself. The night felt close and heavy, and Morel knew that the moral pressure pressing on Colette Delvaux was no longer invisible. It had grown into something that would soon demand a release, and when it came, it would be quiet and human, not the dramatic ending the town imagined. The morning began without wind. A thin fog drifted along the square, softening the edges of buildings, making the world appear hesitant, as if it wasn't sure it wanted to be seen. Inspector Luc Morel rose before the bell rang and dressed with the same careful motions as always. He noticed his own reflection in the window, pale, steady, watchful, and thought, not for the first time, that he had become a part of this town's silence. He walked toward the inn, passing empty streets and closed shutters. The Red Lantern sign swayed gently above the door, its red paint faded and chipped. He paused a moment before knocking. No answer. He knocked again, softer this time, as though pressing his presence into the wood. Finally, the door creaked open. Colette stood there, barefoot, her hair loose around her shoulders. Her eyes were dry, but they had that brittle quality Morel recognized, the look of someone whose tears had already emptied themselves somewhere private. "May I come in?" he asked. She stepped aside wordlessly. Inside, the air smelled faintly of damp wood and cold ashes from the hearth. A single chair had been moved near the window, as if she had spent the night watching the street. "You didn't sleep," he said gently. She shook her head. "You went to the river again." Her hands tightened around the fabric of her nightdress. "It's the only place that listens." He sat at the table, waiting. He had learned not to chase words. They came on their own, like cautious animals when the air was still enough. "I thought it would feel lighter," she whispered, after a long silence. "What would?" "Burning the letters, hiding the scarf, pretending I don't know." Her voice trailed off. She turned her face toward the window, her profile sharp against the pale light. "But it only gets heavier. I wake up with it sitting on my chest." Morel didn't move, didn't speak. Her confession wasn't complete, and he knew pressing her would close it like a door. He wasn't the man everyone thought he was," she said finally. Her voice was small, and yet the words seemed to echo in the empty room. He had other lives, other promises. Those letters were from someone in Liège, a woman. She wanted him to come back to her, said she was tired of waiting. Morel let the words settle in the air. "He told me about her once," Colette continued. "Late one night, after too much wine. He said he couldn't leave, that this inn and this town were chains he couldn't break. But he wrote to her anyway, He dreamed of disappearing. "And the night he vanished?" Morel asked softly. She swallowed hard. "He said he was going for a walk. I followed him because I couldn't sleep. I saw him by the river, standing so still. I thought he might just keep walking into the water. But he didn't. He turned, and he saw me and something in his face." She gripped the back of the chair until her knuckles whitened. "He said I looked like my mother. He said it like an apology. And then he walked away. That was the last time." But the house was quiet, except for the ticking of a wall clock. Outside, a cart rattled over the cobblestones and faded into silence again. Morel watched her breathing, shallow and quick, like she was bracing against some invisible weight. "What did you do then?" he asked. "I went back to bed, pretended nothing had happened, but when morning came he was gone. His boots, his scarf, even his pipe, gone. And the letters were still on the table. I knew people would find them, so I burned them in the mill. I thought I was protecting him. Or maybe myself." Tears finally came, soft and sudden. She didn't cover her face, didn't sob. They just slid down her cheeks in silence. Morel felt the rawness of it, the quiet collapse that wasn't about crime or law, but the unbearable weight of family shame. "You're not the reason he's gone," he said quietly. She shook her head. "I didn't stop him. I didn't tell anyone. And now everyone looks at me like I'm a liar, or worse. Maybe I am." By noon, word had begun to spread that something had broken inside the inn. The cafe murmured with half-heard sentences. Madeleine came to stand in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron, as if that could remove the unease from her fingers. She finally spoke. She whispered to Morel when he returned for coffee. "She spoke to herself more than to me," he said. "And the truth? It's not the kind that brings peace," he said. Across the square, Colette's shutter closed with a soft finality. The town seemed to exhale in unison, a low hum of acceptance that someone had bent under the weight everyone had been watching. That evening, Morel walked to the river again. Mist rose from the surface, curling like smoke. He imagined Henri Delvaux stepping into this water, the slow current tugging at his coat, the cold closing around him without resistance. Not an act of violence, an act of surrender, a man escaping the life he had built for himself, leaving the burden on the daughter who loved him enough to protect his absence. He took the scarf from his pocket and held it a moment before setting it on the railing of the bridge. He did not throw it in. Let the river keep its secrets. It already had more than enough. In his room, he opened his notebook and wrote the day's entry. "She has broken. Not loudly, not in the way towns expect. Her collapse is made of whispers and burned paper. He is gone because he chose to be. She is left because she had no choice." He closed the book and sat in silence, the fog thickening outside the window. The quiet collapse of Colette Delvaux had not solved a case in the formal sense. It had only revealed what Morel already suspected, that in this town truth carried no triumph, only a heavier kind of silence. The fog did not lift for 3 days. It clung to the roofs, to the windows, to the trees along the riverbank, softening every line and edge until the town felt like a painting left unfinished. Inspector Luc Morel walked the square each morning and each evening, his coat damp at the hem, his shoes leaving dark prints that quickly faded into the mist. Life went on, but quietly, as if muffled by the grey air. By the 4th morning, the talk began to settle into something that resembled a conclusion. It had started at the cafe, where gossip ripened like fruit left too long in the sun. "They've decided he ran away," Madeleine said to Morel, as she placed a cup of black coffee on his table. Everyone says it now. Who is everyone? The baker, the postman, even old Madame Roussel. They say he packed his things in the night and went to Liège or maybe Antwerp. A man chasing his second youth, a man with too much wine in his blood and not enough loyalty in his heart. Morel sipped the coffee and said nothing. It's easier this way, she added, her voice lower now. No one wants to talk about the river or about worse things. If a man leaves for another woman, it's shameful, yes, but at least it's human. Death is harder to look in the eye. The Red Lantern Inn had closed its doors to customers. Colette stayed inside, her curtains drawn, a single light burning at night in the upstairs window. The square seemed to grow used to her absence, to her silence, as if she had been absorbed into the inn's wood and stone. People began speaking of her less, as though forgetting her would make the town lighter. Morel watched all this with the detached patience of a man who had seen it before. He had learned that truth did not travel in a straight line. It bent and softened, reshaped by need and fear, until it resembled something the town could live with. By the week's end, the official story had taken root. Henri Delvaux had left in the night for a woman in another city. The story was not printed in the paper. The town was too small for that. But it was told in every shop, repeated at every table, a lie that everyone accepted because it was easier than facing the black water of the river or the ache in Colette's eyes. On the seventh evening, Morel stood by the river again. The mist was lighter now, lifting in soft curls, and the water reflected the dull yellow glow of the street lamps. He leaned on the railing and thought of the scarf, the letters, and the soft click of the inn door at night. Etienne joined him, his breath visible in the chill air. "So that's that then," the café owner said. "He's gone. A man like that, well, you can't hold on to someone who doesn't want to stay." "Do you believe it?" Morel asked. Etienne hesitated. "I believe it enough to sleep at night." They watched the water in silence for a while. A faint ripple moved across the surface where something, a fish, or maybe a branch, broke the reflection of the lamp. "The town will forget him," Etienne said finally. "They'll forget her too, if she stays hidden long enough. That's how it works. Memory bends to whatever story we can bear." A few days later, the local constable delivered a folded piece of paper to Morel's room. It was stamped with the seal of the small administrative office that handled missing persons in the district. Case closed. Henri Delvaux, presumed voluntarily absent. No evidence of foul play. No further action required. The language was as dry as it was final. Morel read it twice and folded it into his notebook without comment. The life in the town resumed its rhythms. The bakery opened early, its warm smells spilling into the wall. Street children played by the fountain, their voices carrying across the square. At the café, the regulars returned to discussing weather, crops, and the price of bread. Even the inn's closed windows no longer drew the same glances. The town had tucked its curiosity away, like a dangerous object in a drawer. But Morel saw the subtle changes. He noticed how Madeleine avoided walking past the inn at night. He saw Etienne's wife cross herself quietly when the church bell rang at dusk. He heard the way old Madame Roussel said, "Men like that always leave, with just a bit too much certainty." These were the signs of a town living with a lie, polishing it into a story until it fit the shape of their days. One evening, Colette opened her door. Morel saw her from across the square, standing in the threshold, her face pale in the lamplight. She stepped out just far enough to empty a basin of water into the street, then lingered, her eyes scanning the square without focus. For a moment, He thought she might walk toward him, might speak. Instead, she turned back inside, closing the door softly behind her. He realized then that she had accepted the lie too. It was her shield now, her only way to remain in this town without breaking completely. Her father was not dead. He was gone. Gone to another woman, another city. The story was unbearable, but it was survivable. So that night, Morel wrote in his notebook, "The town has decided on its truth. It is not the river. It is not the silence of the inn. It is a man in a train carriage leaving behind the life he could not live. They will speak of him this way until the years smooth the memory to dust. And she will live beneath this lie because it is lighter than the weight of the water." He closed the book and placed it on the table, his hand resting on the cover for a long time. He knew that the story was finished for the town, but not for him, and not for Colette Delvaux. The first frost arrived overnight. A white sheen coated the square, delicate and thin, catching the light of the morning sun in soft glimmers. Inspector Luc Morel rose earlier than usual, the cold air slipping through the window as he dressed. He lingered over his shaving, watching his own breath cloud the glass. There was a stillness in him that mirrored the town outside. By now, everyone had chosen their version of events. Henri Delvaux was gone, off chasing the life he had long wanted, but never dared to claim. The official paper called it voluntary absence. The town whispered about a woman in Liège. They spoke of it with a kind of satisfaction, like a puzzle solved, though the solution was a fiction stitched together by fear and habit. Only Morel and Colette knew the heavier truth, and even between them it was never said aloud. He walked to the river that morning, the frost crunching softly under his shoes. The water was lower now, revealing slick stones near the bank. He rested his hands on the railing of the bridge and listened to the quiet. A crow flapped overhead, its caw cutting through the pale air. In that silence, he thought of all the truths that would never be spoken, the late-night letters, the burned paper, the broken look on Colette's face when she spoke of her father's last night. He thought of the scarf he had left on the railing days ago, now gone, claimed by the wind or the river. He had been a policeman long enough to know that truth had no obligation to be spoken. It could live in quiet rooms, in the tremor of a hand, or the weight of a gaze. The law wanted facts. Life offered only pieces of sorrow. By midday, he found himself at the Red Lantern Inn. The door opened after a long pause, and Colette stood there. Her hair was tied back this time, her face washed, though her eyes still carried that soft, bruised look of sleeplessness. "You're out," he said gently. "I thought maybe I should sweep the steps," she said, though no broom was in her hand. He nodded, stepping aside as she moved on to the threshold. They stood in the doorway, the cold air curling around them. "They've all decided," she said quietly. "Yes." "And you," she searched his face, "you know it's not true." He held her gaze for a long moment. "I know what I know, but it doesn't change what they need to believe." Her lips trembled, but she said nothing. "Do you want me to speak?" he asked finally. She looked down at her hands, twisting her fingers. "If you speak, they will only stare. They will pity me more. And I cannot bear more eyes on me." Morel felt a small shift inside him then, a quiet understanding that his role was not to carry the law, not here. It was to hold the truth in silence, like a stone kept in a pocket, a weight both grounding and secret. He left the inn and walked through the square, passing the bakery where the smell of fresh bread spilled into the cold air. People nodded at him with the easy familiarity of those who have accepted a story and tucked it neatly into their lives. "Inspector," called the butcher, leaning out his doorway. "I hear he was seen on the road to Liège. Someone swears it." Morel only nodded. He did not correct him, did not ask for details. He let the words pass like smoke in the air. By afternoon, he returned to his small rented room above Etienne's cafe. He opened his notebook and stared at the blank page, his pen hovering. Slowly, he began to write. "The case is closed, but the truth lives in silence. I will not disturb the lie the town has chosen. It is a gentle lie, a survivable lie. Sometimes that is all people have. He is in the river, she is in the shadows, and I am in between, carrying the weight neither of them can hold in the open." He closed the book and set it on the windowsill. Outside, the frost was already melting, leaving small, clear beads of water running along the edges of the roofs. That evening, he sat in the cafe as the last light faded. Etienne poured him a glass of wine without asking. The other patrons spoke of markets, of trains delayed by the cold, of a dog that had gone missing on the far side of town. Henri Delvau's name was not spoken once. Morel listened to the chatter and the clinking of cups. He thought of the river, the inn, the scarf, and the look on Colette's face. He thought of how easily the town had absorbed its own story, and how the real one would fade like mist, leaving only a soft impression in the memory of two people. When the cafe emptied, he stepped outside into the brittle night air. The square was quiet, the lamplight trembling in the light breeze. He stood there for a long time, breathing the cold, his silence becoming part of the town's silence, until there was no difference between them. The snow came early that year, softening the sharp edges of the town and burying the last trace of autumn beneath its clean, pale weight. By December, the square looked like a postcard, the fountain capped in white, the roofs dipped in sugar, and the narrow streets muffled under a soft hush. Life moved more slowly now, the cold making every errand deliberate. By then, Henri Delvau's name was no longer spoken. The Red Lantern Inn had remained closed for weeks, its sign swinging silently in the wind. A few travellers came through, puzzled by the darkened windows, but most were directed to the boarding house near the church. The town had adjusted, as it always did, by folding absence into routine. Inspector Luc Morel had become a quiet figure among them, walking his usual circuits through the square and along the river. People nodded to him politely, and he nodded back. His silence no longer drew questions. It was as if the lie they all lived under had grown roots, holding fast beneath the snow. Madeleine, the cafe waitress, was the first to speak of it in a new way. One morning, as she wiped the counter, she said to Etienne in a voice Morel could hear clearly from his table, "You know, it's been months now. I wonder if she'll sell the inn." Etienne shrugged. "What else can she do? She can't keep it closed forever. And she can't run it alone, not like before." "She could hire someone." "No one will take the job. Everyone says the place is unlucky now. People like stories, Madeleine, but they don't like to eat or sleep where they think sorrow lingers." They both fell quiet then, glancing toward the frosted window, as if the inn itself could hear them. Morel didn't speak. He only lifted his cup and sipped the bitter coffee. The winter settled heavily on the town, and time began to stretch. The rhythm of days became predictable: morning frost, the sound of shovels scraping stone, the lazy drift of smoke from chimneys, the church bell marking hours in a world that otherwise felt suspended. One afternoon, Morel noticed Colette standing in the square. It was the first time he had seen her outside in weeks. She wore a heavy grey coat, her hair tucked beneath a scarf, and she carried a single loaf of bread in her gloved hands. She did not look at anyone as she walked, her gaze fixed on the ground. No one approached her. People moved aside slightly, polite but distant, as though she carried something fragile and invisible with her. Morel watched as she climbed the steps to the inn and disappeared inside, the door closing softly behind her. It struck him then how thoroughly the town had conspired to erase the incident. They had taken the truth, the raw, jagged truth, and filed it down into a story that fit in the palm of their hand. A man had left. A daughter was lonely. Life continued. That was all. By February, the inn was sold to a man from Namur. He arrived one morning with a small cart and a thin moustache, shaking hands in the square and nodding enthusiastically at everything. He seemed unbothered by the town's murmured warnings, eager to start fresh with a new coat of paint and a different name. "The Willow," he called it. He took down the old Red Lantern sign on a grey afternoon, letting it fall into the snow with a muted thud. Morel was there, standing in the square with his hands in his pockets. He watched the new owner hammer up the fresh sign, his breath puffing clouds into the cold. It was as if the old inn had never existed, as if the past had been wiped away with a single brush stroke. Colette left the town soon after. No one saw her pack, and no one knew where she went. A letter arrived for Etienne a week later, postmarked from Lille, thanking him for his kindness and asking him to forward any stray mail to the address she included. He read it aloud in the café, his voice soft, and then folded it into his apron. "She's gone," he said. "Maybe it's for the best." The others nodded. It was easier to imagine her somewhere else than to picture her walking past the inn each day, carrying the weight they all pretended not to see. The seasons turned, and the square bloomed again. Tourists returned in spring, admiring the neat houses and the tidy riverbank. The Willow Inn opened its doors to new guests, its windows bright with flower boxes, the scent of frying onions drifting out in the evenings. Only Morel carried the old story in his chest, heavy as a stone. He thought of it sometimes as he walked the bridge at dusk, the water dark and rippling below. He thought of the scarf, of Colette's trembling voice, of the way silence had become its own kind of pact. The town had moved on, just as towns always do, but he knew that some truths did not vanish. They simply sank to the bottom, like silt in the river, waiting for someone to stir the water years later. In that spring, as the last frost melted, Morel stood once more by the quay to the river and watched the lamplight stretch across its surface. He realized the story had ended not with a revelation, but with a long exhale, a quiet fading into the ordinary rhythm of life. The town would thrive again. The lie would harden into memory, and memory into a kind of history no one questioned. And he, the keeper of the unspoken, would walk his circuits, nodding to the butcher, the baker, and the children at the fountain, carrying a truth that belonged to no one but himself. It was almost 10 years before Inspector Luc Morel spoke of the Red Lantern Inn again. By then his hair had thinned, his gait had slowed, and he no longer wore the uniform that had once defined his quiet authority. Retirement had given him a different rhythm, long mornings with coffee and the newspaper, afternoons walking the river paths, evenings with the radio murmuring softly in the background. The town had changed, as towns do. New shops lined the square, a small tourist office opened near the church, and the old bakery now sold postcards and local honey. Most of the people who had whispered about Henri Delvaux and his inn had either moved on or grown older, their memories softening like photographs left in the sun. The Willow Inn was still there, painted a cheerful yellow. Travellers came and went, leaving with polite reviews and warm impressions of the quaint riverside town. No one asked about the name it once bore, or the story it once held. One late afternoon in spring, Morel was sitting on the bench near the bridge when a stranger approached. She was in her early 30s with a dark green coat and a curious expression. She carried a small camera around her neck, the kind tourists used for details they might forget. "Excuse me," she said softly, as if reluctant to disturb him. "Are you from here?" He nodded. "I'm doing a little research about the inn." She gestured toward the Willow. "Someone told me it used to be called the Red Lantern, that there was an incident." Her voice was cautious, the way people speak when they're chasing ghosts but aren't sure they believe in them. Morel studied her face. He noticed the faint tension around her eyes, the kind of curiosity that wasn't just idle. She wanted something real, some scrap of a story that would make her journey worth it. "Who told you that?" he asked. "A woman at the market. She said I should ask the retired inspector. I assume that's you." He smiled faintly. Word travelled in small towns, even after a decade. "Yes, I suppose I am." But for a long moment he didn't speak. He looked out over the river, where sunlight flashed on the slow current. He thought of the first frost, of the smell of damp wood inside the inn, of Colette's trembling hands as she held the burned fragment of her father's letter. "Most people prefer the version they've been told," he said finally. "It's simpler that way. A man who left town, a daughter who moved away, life goes on." "And the real version?" the woman asked, almost whispering. Morel hesitated. He felt the weight of the years pressing against his chest, the silent pact he had kept with a girl, now long gone. He had carried the truth quietly, like a stone in his coat pocket, and he knew that once he spoke it aloud, even to a stranger, it would change something inside him. "He didn't leave," Morel said at last. His voice was soft, like someone recalling a dream. "He died there, in that inn." The woman's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't interrupt. "There was an argument, not a violent one, just words. The kind that cut deeper than anyone expects. He had been drinking. He went to the river. Or maybe he meant only to stand on the bridge for a while, but he never came back." He paused, letting the memory settle. The river whispered beneath the bridge as if echoing the truth he had swallowed for years. His daughter. She understood? She lived with that knowledge until it became too heavy. And the town accepted a lie because the lie was kinder. It gave them a way to keep looking each other in the eye. The woman stood in silence, absorbing his words. She seemed to sense that asking more would break the delicate thread of confession. After a while, she nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said. Morel inclined his head, a gesture both polite and final. He felt lighter, though the story still sat in him like a fading echo. "Do me a favor," he said as she turned to leave. "Don't write it down. Let it stay a whisper." She smiled, a quiet understanding in her eyes. "I will." That evening, as the sun dropped behind the rooftops, Morel walked to the bridge one last time. He leaned on the railing and watched the current shift and shimmer in the fading light. The water had carried many winters and many secrets since that night. And now it carried this one too, no longer held only by him. He thought of Colette and wondered where she had gone, whether she had managed to build a life free from the shadow of that winter. He imagined her somewhere in a city, older now, walking a street lined with shops she didn't know, her father's memory like a faint smell of smoke on her clothes. The square behind him was alive with the sounds of the present, laughter from the cafe terrace, a bicycle bell, the clink of glasses. Life had not waited for the truth. It had gone on, as it always does, covering the old stories with layers of new ones. As dusk settled over the river, Morel felt a deep, quiet relief. He had kept his silence long enough to let the town heal, and now, with only a few words, he had let the weight slip from his chest into the flow of time. He turned toward home, his steps slow and steady, the cool evening air brushing against his face. Behind him, the river whispered, carrying the last fragment of the Red Lantern story into the night